Hello and welcome to Macroeconomics Module 7, Lecture 6, the concluding lecture of this jam-packed module, where we're finishing off what is basically a set, these last three modules, 5, 6, 7. Remember at the start of Module 5, long ago, back when you were young, before your dreams were blasted, and we introduced the aggregate supply, aggregate demand model and explained how it works. And then with Module 6, how the Keynesians understand it works. And now Module 7, bringing in the long run and people's predictions about the future and how that affects the present. So this is part 2 of our discussion of the Phillips curve and expectations. So the Phillips curve is this line that shows the relationship between inflation and unemployment. And if you look at the Phillips curve of the 1960s, you see that as inflation got higher, unemployment is going down. And the basic reason for that, if we ignore doing it on an aggregate supply, aggregate demand diagram, in Milton Friedman's story is as the prices of products rose faster than the wages of workers, from the business's point of view, the workers got cheaper and they hired more workers and unemployment went down. And for some economists, then they just drew the conclusion higher inflation leads to lower unemployment. But Friedman had the insight to realize it wasn't just higher inflation, it was inflation higher than people expected, because people are getting cost of living raises equal to the inflation they expect. And so when the actual inflation in 1966 is higher than the inflation people expect in 1966, and thus higher than the cost of living raise they're getting, then workers are getting cheaper and unemployment goes down. But then Friedman said, how stupid are people? How many years in a row can you trick them? I mean, how many years can you have 3% inflation and they're only expecting 1% inflation? And Friedman's answer is people are 2 to 3 years stupid. After about 2 years, they'll start to catch on. And then so after 2 or 3 years of inflation being at 3%, people will start to expect 3%, and thus they'll be getting 3% cost of living raises. And then when prices go up 3%, cost of living raise goes up 3%. From the boss's point of view, the workers are no cheaper than they were before the price increases, because what matters is relative change in price of the product to relative wage of the workers. And if the price of the product goes up 3%, but the wage of the worker goes up 3%, then how much cheaper are workers? None cheaper. So how many workers do you hire extra because they're cheaper? None extra hiring of workers. And then unemployment's at U sub n. And thus, instead of being at 4% unemployment, you would be back at 6% unemployment after a few years of 3% inflation. I mentioned last lecture that the inflation that was expected in the 1960s was about 1%. And where did I get that number from? If you want to know what people are expecting inflation to be, what you look at is at what rate of inflation is unemployment close to the natural rate. And if we take 6% as being the natural rate, we can see that we were at 6% unemployment in those early years of the 60s when inflation was very close to 1%. And this is mostly review, right? Thus, Friedman draws a Phillips curve straight up and down at U sub n, and he calls that the long-run Phillips curve. That is the rate of unemployment you're going to be at in the long run once wages have adjusted to the change in people's expectation of inflation, which has adjusted to the actual inflation. So for a while you can fool people and have 3% inflation and they only expect 1%, and you go to those actual points of 1966, 1967. But once they catch on, then you're going to go to 6% unemployment at 3% inflation. Can you still get less unemployment when people expect 3% inflation? Sure, you just got to fool them again. You got to raise inflation up to 5%. And workers are getting 3% raises because they expected 3%. Now that's again, from the business's point of view, the workers are getting cheaper compared to the price of the product, so you hire on extra workers. And so you see with that blue line, at 5% inflation, when people expect, EX stands for expect, INF stands for inflation. When people are expecting 3% inflation, if you give them 5% inflation, unemployment again goes below U sub n. Of course, Friedman's is going to point out not forever until they catch on. After a couple of years of getting 5% inflation, they'll start to expect 5% inflation. And then they'll be getting 5% cost of living raises. And then you'll be back at U sub n. The whole Phillips curve will shift again so that you'll be at 6% unemployment at 5% inflation, and you always shift back to being on the long run Phillips curve. So the short run, you can fool people. You have the slanted C Phillips curve. In the long run, people adjust to what they see going on, and you have the straight up and down at U sub n Phillips curve. So Friedman made this argument back in 1969. In the 70s, economists were really thinking about expectations. Now that Friedman had pointed out how important expectations were to people's behavior, which impacted on how the economy is working, they were giving a lot of thought to how people predict things. And it was actually one of Friedman's students who came up with the next step. And he invented or brought into economics from math this idea of rational expectations. Friedman's expectations would be called adaptive expectations. Adaptive expectations are when you expect the future to look like the last couple of years. And as the past changes, right, as inflation goes from 3 to 5%, after a couple of years you change your expectation from 3 to 5%. But rational expectations are when you take into account all that is going on to make the best possible prediction of the future. And so these, the inflation of 3% in the middle 60s and 5% in the late 60s, that didn't come from nowhere. The government was taking actions that were causing that. Expansionary fiscal policy, or even Friedman, of course, would say printing up more money. And the thing is, people can see you printing up more money. So when people see the government printing up more money, let's say for the last 3 years, the government's printed up 3% more money and inflation has been 3%. And then this year you see them printing up 6% more money. Should you expect 3% inflation again because that's what it was last year? Or should you expect 6% inflation because that's what you would expect in response to the government's changing actions? And the rational expectationists are going to say you should take into account, you see what the Federal Reserve Board is doing. Why aren't you taking that into account and raising your prediction of inflation? In a sports analogy, it would be in adaptive expectations. You expect the team to finish this year. Your prediction is this year they'll finish the same as last year. With rational expectations, you take into account the players they've lost and the players they've gained, and how that will change how good a team they are and how that should change their record. So what does it do to how our aggregate supply, aggregate demand model of the macroeconomy works if people have rational expectations? And the thing about rational expectations is if people have rational expectations, they won't be caught by surprise by the things that happen caused by what the government is doing. It's not saying nobody's ever caught by surprise by what happens in the world, but you won't overlook obvious factors that are affecting things and be caught by surprise by their effect. So here's our aggregate supply, aggregate demand model showing what happens with an increase in aggregate demand. And how it's worked up till now is the government, through expansionary fiscal policy or printing up more money, causes aggregate demand to go to the right, and we go to the intersection of aggregate demand and short-run aggregate supply, and we have unusually high output and unusually low unemployment for a while. And then Friedman would say the workers catch on that there's going to be inflation, they get cost of living raises, and after a couple of years the short-run aggregate supply curve shifts to the left and we're back to Q sub n and U sub n. But the rational expectationists are saying, why don't people see the government printing up more money, realize aggregate demand is going to move, and then simultaneously negotiate raises with their bosses, cost of living raises, that kick in with the increase in buying so that the two curves move at the same time. that at the same time there's extra buying and inflation because of the increase in the amount of money, that the workers are getting raises. And if these two curves move at the same time, you don't go from Q1 into the inflationary gap and then back to Q sub n. You just go straight from Q1 and P1 to Q2 and P2. The way that this is commonly expressed is in rational expectations, the long run becomes the short run. Or in other words, how long is the short run? The short run is zero. As you're looking at this diagram, what are you looking at? You're looking at us instantaneously going from where we are to where we're going to be at the long run, and basically not going to the short run. Because in Friedman's term, the short run is where people were fooled about what was going to happen. And Friedman said, well, they'll be fooled for a couple of years and they'll catch on. The rational expectation is saying, why are they fooled at all? They're saying when the government prints up more money, why should they be fooled for 2 years there's going to be inflation? Why don't they realize the inflation is coming and make their arrangements to compensate even simultaneously with the inflation arriving? And if that's true, the government cannot increase output by increasing aggregate demand, because whatever they do to increase aggregate demand and move the aggregate demand curve to the right, the people see them doing that and arrange for wage increases that counteract the inflation, and the short-run aggregate supply curve goes to the left at the same time, and so you just go from Q1 P1 to Q2 P2. I'll mention that the most famous of the rational expectationists is Robert E. Lucas Jr. He was the one who was a student of Friedman, who wrote articles, a couple of famous articles in the 1970s in economic journals, laying out this logic, asking himself, what he asked himself is, why were people being fooled by what the government was doing for a couple of years? Why couldn't they see what the government is doing, catch on to what's going to happen, and react? And when he asked himself that question, he said the answer is they should. That's what they should do. And then he started to follow the logical implications of this, and that's created the school of rational expectationists and macroeconomists. So to repeat, you had the Keynesians of the 60s who weren't even considering expectations at all. When they asked the question, how long can you fool people? Implicitly, their answer was forever. They'll never catch on. There's going to be higher inflation. And then Friedman came along and said, and then, so you just had the slanted C-Phillips curve. Then Friedman came along and said, well, you can fool them for a couple years, but then they catch on. And thus you had the slanted C-Phillips curve that was in play for a couple years, but then you switched over to the long-run Phillips curve, which was that line straight up and down at U sub n. And then Robert E. Lucas comes along and says, but why are they even fooled for a couple of years? Why don't they see the government running deficits? Why don't they see the Federal Reserve Board creating money? Catch on to the implication this is going to cause higher inflation. React to the coming higher inflation by getting cost of living raises that will kick in when the inflation kicks in. And thus the time that they are fooled is zero, so you go straight to the long-run equilibrium. Thus, in the rational expectations model, there's not two Phillips curves. The slanted C when people are being fooled, and then the one straight up and down in the long run once they've caught on. Because they catch on right away, there's only the one Phillips curve. And it's Friedman's curve, just a line straight up and down at U sub n. And so it would look like this. Does this mean we're always at U sub n then? No, because we're not always on this curve. Because the rational expectationists are not saying no one is ever fooled in predicting the future. They say people are fooled all the time because the world's complicated and predicting the future is hard. It's just they're not going to be fooled by the Federal Reserve Board creating more money because they see that happening. Or they're not going to be fooled by the expansionary fiscal deficits because they can see the budget Congress is passing. For example, let's think people think inflation is going to be 4%, but actually it's only going to be 1%. Now there'll be a recession because from the business's point of view, They've agreed to give 4% raises to the workers because they think the price of products is going to go up 4%, but it actually only goes up 1%. So from their point of view, the workers are getting more expensive, and the businesses respond by laying off workers. There will be a recession. Now you might say, well, then can the government fix this then by just printing up more money so that actual inflation equals 4%, which is what people are predicting? And Robert E. Lucas Jr. is going to say no, because if people are predicting 4% inflation, and then they see the government printing up 3% more money more than they expected, they'll say, oh, inflation is going to be 3% higher than I thought. Inflation is going to be 7%. So that when actual inflation hits 4%, people's expectations of inflation is 7%, workers are still getting more expensive, and businesses are still laying them off. Robert E. Lucas Jr. would also say, what makes the government so smart that they realize there's only going to be 1% inflation when everyone else thinks there's going to be 4% inflation? So he would challenge the basic premise: the government understands what's going on more than the markets anyway. But even if the government did, he's pointing out why this wouldn't work. So the rational expectationists then tend to believe the best thing for the government to do is just keep things stable and let people figure out their mistakes. That, we'll go into a recession when people expect 4% inflation, but it's only 1%. But Lucas is going to say, but as inflation actually is only 1%, people will quickly realize that was a mistake and lower their expectation to 1%, and then we'll get out of the recession. And if the government comes in and starts printing up more money or less money or running deficits or running surpluses and moving the aggregate demand curve around, all that does is muddy the waters, so it's harder to predict the future accurately and correct for your mistakes, and then recessions and inflations will last longer than if you just let people have a nice, stable environment to predict the future as accurately as they can. You see the question here. So how did the rational expectationists of the 1960s explain that almost perfect slanted C curve of the 60s? And the short answer, it's like a trick question, is they didn't have to, because there were no rational expectations of the 1970s. It's not an accident that rational expectations happened in the 70s and not the 60s. And the reason is because people started to change their behavior in the 70s. People were not worried about predicting inflation in the 60s because for years and years and years it had always been 1%. We didn't have inflation in the 1950s. President Eisenhower didn't put up with such nonsense. But once inflation became a thing in the second half of the 60s, people started to worry that there'd be inflation, they wouldn't get matching raises, and they started to pay attention. Thus, they started to factor in what the government was doing in a way they had not before. And this all illustrates one reason macroeconomics is hard. People can behave differently in different times, and a theory that explains correctly in one age may not work in another. You need a different understanding of how the macroeconomy works in a world where people are worried about inflation and making predictions about the future versus a world where people aren't worried about inflation because in 30 years there's been next to no inflation. All right, we're at 1840. If I stop talking now, I can finish before 19 minutes, so I'm going to. So you know what to do. Read the book, take the quiz, take the big module test, and then you're ready for the next module. Till then, take care.